The question that the person making the discernment needs to ask is, how is God calling me to love Him? In my early days of priestly ministry, I had the privilege of working with many young adults, often just out of college or trade school or other university and academic settings. Many of them were young urban professionals working in the Washington, D.C. area where I hail from. And many of them were discerning their vocation, what God was calling them to as their path in life. The vast majority of them were called and are called to the married life. There are a few in the group who are eventually called to the priesthood and religious life. But the question was always the same. Father, how do I discern my vocation? Is there a technique or a way to think through this very important question? My name is Father Jerome Magat, and I'm the Vice Rector and a Professor of Moral Theology at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California. And if you like our channel and our content, please feel free to like and subscribe and share. So today we're going to look at the question, how do I discern my vocation? Great question and a very important one. First, we need to start with the conviction that each of us in God's designs of providence has a specific plan for each of our lives. Part of discerning a vocation is discovering that plan and then praying for the grace to have the courage to answer it. As I mentioned earlier, most people will be called to marriage. That is the natural order of things, and that is very important for society and for the church to continue to propagate our race. It's important that people get married and have children and have families. This is crucial for society and the church. But there are a few of us who are called to the priesthood and religious life. So I want to start with the idea of vocation, because I don't want to restrict the idea of vocation to simply those called to the priesthood and religious life. For instance, when I have a couple coming for marriage preparation, I often will tell them that they need to have properly discerned, intentionally discerned, the answer to two questions. One, are they called to marriage? And two, are they called to marry the person sitting next to them in my office, their intended spouse? So the word vocation comes from the Latin word vocare, V-O-C-A-R-E, which means simply in Latin, to call. Here we understand that call to come from God. And generally speaking, the vocations are to the married life, to priesthood or religious life, and to some, the single life. So God calls each of us to live out His plan for our lives in one of these three ways. I want to spend a moment talking about the single life first, because most of what I'll say after that will be about the married life and vocation to the priesthood and religious life. The single vocation is not a default vocation for people who could not find someone to marry. People who are genuinely living the single vocation have deliberately chosen to forgo marriage for often service in the church or higher callings that invite them to put aside their natural desire for marriage and family in service of a greater good. In fact, historically, in Western civilization, there have been a number of professions whereby the participants were often expected not to be married. For instance, teachers in yesteryear, and even soldiers, that the demands of their particular careers were such that their vocation to live the single life was the most appropriate way to express and to live out their careers. Again, here distinguishing between a vocation and a career. Career, I'm thinking more like a job. Vocation is a permanent, stable way of life. Now, earlier I had mentioned that if a couple comes to me for marriage preparation, they need to have discerned that they're called, one, to marriage in general, and two, marriage of the person they're intending to marry. Those questions need to be established even before they can approach the priest for marriage preparation. In fact, it's usually my hope as the preparer for marriage that the couple has discerned this in prayer, that they just haven't fallen into the relationship or just seemed like the right thing to do, that they prayerfully asked God some serious questions and gotten some clarity on answers that He and He alone has. So allow me to frame it then in this way. The idea of a vocation, vocare in Latin, God's call, is at the end of the day ultimately a call to love. And the question that the person making the discernment needs to ask is, how is God calling me to love Him? For most, as I've mentioned before, this will take place through the vocation to marry, which means a man or a woman is married to a person of the opposite sex. They will form a community called a family, and their universe of reality becomes somewhat restricted to those very intimate relationships. This is the way that most people live out their lives. And sociologists and psychologists tell us that some of the happiest people in the world are people who are in healthy, holy, and stable marriages that are low conflict and filled with the love of children. This is how most people are called to love. But for instance, priests and religious, in discerning their vocation, might say, while I'll always feel a natural attraction to be married to a member of the opposite sex, that might be too limiting for me. In other words, God has placed into my heart this capacity to love on a much wider frame any number of people who I'm not related to, and maybe don't know certainly as well as a spouse and children, but that limited universe of marriage and family might not be enough. So often when you meet very holy and happy priests and religious, you can see how expansive their pastoral love is for the people that they serve day in and day out in any number of pastoral settings all over the world. It's not that they're not attracted to marriage. It's just that marriage would not have been enough. The other question that someone might want to ask when they're discerning their vocation is, when they wake up in the morning and they know that they're called to love, where do they see themselves most freely making that gift of self to God and the wider family of the faithful and in society in general? For most people, it's going to be that family, that spouse, those children. But for those, for instance, who are discerning vocations of the priesthood and religious life, they are animated by the possibility of engaging individuals and helping them come to Christ and to become a member of His flock and to live in communion with Him more intimately. The grand beauty of, for instance, the priesthood and religious life vis-a-vis marriage is that both sacraments complement each other. They live in dynamic tension. As a priest, I spend many, many hours every week in service of married people. Most parish priests actually do this. And married persons are often the inspiration for my living my promises of ordination faithfully. Conversely, married people can look at the dedication and devotion of their priest and religious in their parish or in their community, and when things in their marriage get a little bit bumpy or rocky, they understand there are other people in our community who are making even perhaps bigger sacrifices than I'm making by being available to the wider flock and serving them, albeit not in the intimacy of a particular marriage or family. So these sacraments complement each other, and it's important to realize that discerning your vocation is always a discernment on how to love God, how to sacrifice for Him, and to bring many more souls to the kingdom. If you like our content and our channel, feel free to like and subscribe and share. If you'd like to see more content produced by St. Patrick's Seminary, feel free to click on the link above. And again, thanks for watching, and God bless.